So welcome back to the Floriani Software Fundamentals video series on FTCU. My name is Mark Garetz and I'm a National Floriani educator. And in this section we're going to be covering how you would create both custom motif stitches as well as custom both standard and fancy fills. To create a custom motif in FTCU, we first need to understand how motifs are created and what kind of size we want to make them and how we actually do that. So the best way to look at a motif is to actually just open one up and just examine it, and I would encourage you to do that. So let's go ahead and open one. Now our motif editor is here under Tools, and we have an item right here called the Motif Pattern Editor. And right now, since we don't have anything on the screen, the only thing we can do is load one in. So if I just click Load Motif Pattern, I can pick one, and if I just if I click one without double clicking it or clicking open, I'll see a little preview of it over here. So let's just pick a simple one here. Now let's do this cross here. This is pretty simple. So I'm going to go ahead and click open, and that's going to bring in that cross pattern for me here. And if I turn on 3D, you'll be able to see the stitches. And if I turn on my stitch points right here, then if I click off it, you'll be able to see it's a little hard to see in 3D mode, so let me turn off 3D mode. So here's a stitch point, here's a stitch point, here's a stitch point, etc. And if I select this, and we go over here to our Transform tab, and we look at the size, I happen to be in millimeters, you can see that it's about 10 millimeters by 10 millimeters, and that seems to be pretty standard size for the built-in motifs. So I'd encourage you to create your motifs in about the same size. Now, one thing that's important to understand about the way a motif stitches is it's always going to start over here on the left-hand side and end up over here on the right-hand side, because the next motif stitch is going to go right here and go right next to it. So what you don't want to do is have a starting and ending point that aren't on the same plane, and the easiest way to do that is just put them in the center. And you'll find that almost all, if not all, of the built-in motif stitches start at the left center and end at the right center. And our grid lines are going to be a real help to us to figure out how to draw that motif and get everything all lined up. So let's create a motif. I'm actually going to delete this one. I'll use my delete icon right here. And the first thing we want to really do when we're creating a motif is we want to get our grid and our ruler set up for creating those tiny stitches. And what we want to do is we want to be in millimeters mode, and right now I'm in inches. So I'm going to right click and select metric, then I'm going to right click on my ruler one more time, and I'm going to come down here to my grid settings. And right now you can see that since I was inches, I have an odd number of millimeters here, 6.35. So what we want to do is we want to set up our grid to about 1.5 millimeters or so, or 2, or maybe even 1. And the reason we want to do that is we don't want to make stitches smaller than 1 millimeter, and ideally we really want to keep them about 1.5 millimeters. So let me set up my grid to about 1.5 millimeters. Now if I do that, it's not going to make an even 10 millimeters. You know, it's going to be 9 or 10.5. So I'm actually going to set my spacing to 1, so we have an even 10 millimeters. And so 1 times 10 will be 10. And I'm going to leave my grid major set at every 10 lines. So that will show me where my 10 millimeter mark is, except for it's going to be on the opposite sides of my 0, 0. So what I really want to do to see a 10 millimeter box is I'm going to set these to 5. Okay, so I'm going to set those to 5, and I'm going to click OK. And now you can see my grid here is in millimeters, and here is 0, and here is 10. And what I'm going to do is put my 0, 0 point kind of in the center of the screen, and I'm just going to do that by scrolling it over a little bit. All right, so now my center is right here, and you can see that I have -5 over here. It's not marked, but you can see this is -10, and this would be +5. So from this grid line to this grid line, I've got 10 millimeters, and between these grid lines, I have 1 millimeter squares. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on snap to grid so that when I start entering stitches or points in here that I get perfect alignment on my grid lines. So I'm going to right click on my ruler and turn on snap to grid. And now I have the perfect setup for creating my motif stitch. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a diamond stitch with a line going down the center. So we're going to start over here on the left and we're going to come all the way around like this. And then we're going to jump all the way back over to here. But remember that if I make a stitch that goes from here all the way to here, that is going to be 10 millimeters, which is probably too long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here in the center. And what I want to also make sure is that this stitch from here to here is not too long as well. So I could calculate that, but that's too much math for me. So what I'm just going to do is grab my ruler and I'm going to get right in here approximately and drag down to here. And I can see that that would make a 7 millimeter stitch, which is pretty good. All right, so we're going to go ahead and go back to normal select mode. And actually what we're going to do now is we're going to start entering those stitches. Now, I've warned you when you create embroidery designs to try and avoid the manual stitch tool. This is an area where the manual stitch tool comes in handy. Now, it's not absolutely necessary to do that. We could use our run stitch tool, we could use our artwork tool, but the best way to do it is to do the manual stitch tool. So that's how I'm going to teach it. So what you want to do is click the manual stitch tool, and now when you click, you're going to be putting in stitch points. And that's what we want for a motif stitch. So I'm going to put in a stitch point right here, and remember that's at 0 on my vertical measurement, and you'll always want to be at 0 on the vertical when you start and at 0 when you end. Then I'm going to come up here to this point and click. I'm going to come down here to this point and click. I'm going to come back over here to this point and click. Come here and click. And I'm going to come again to my center point because I come all the way out here. I'm going to get a 10 millimeter stitch. And I know if I do here, it'll be 5. Then I'm going to come here and I'm going to right click to end it. And I have put in my motif. I'll turn on 3D so you can see what that motif would look like. So I'll turn it off. And again, if you look real close right in here, you can see the stitch points. Now, if you want to see how this is actually going to stitch, you can use your slow redraw tool right here. And this button right here and this button right here goes forward and backwards a stitch. So when you are examining what the built-in motifs done by Load Motif, stepping through them to see how they're constructed and how the stitches go back and forth so you can end up back here, that is a very useful tool. So let's do it with this one. We're going to actually turn on 3D here so you can see it stitched. So I'm going to do the first stitch, so that went from here to here. And then I'm going to do the next stitch, 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 and my motif is done. So now I'm going to go back to my regular select mode, and you would think now that I could come in here and I could go to my tools and I could go to my motif pattern editor and it would allow me to save that motif. But you'll see that it's grayed out. And this is something that confuses a lot of people. In order to actually save this motif, these stitches have to be selected in stitch mode. And for that we use our stitch tool here. So I'm going to go ahead and click it, and I can select everything by actually dragging a box around this. I've also got some options here under the stitch tool, which is my lasso. So if I needed to drag a box around something that didn't lend itself to an actual box, I could use the lasso tool, which works just like the lasso tool here, to drag a non-box shape or freehand draw a shape around it. But I can use the normal stitch tool for this because I can fit everything in the box as long as I get up to the top of my screen here and drag a box around it to select all of those stitches. And now I've got all those stitches selected. I can come here to my tools, and if I go to Motif Pattern Editor, you'll see that Save Motif Pattern is now lit up. So I can click that, and it is going to show me a preview of what this motif is going to look like. If I like this, I can click Save. If I want to adjust it now, I would have to click Close and then go back and edit my motif. But I'm going to go ahead and click Save. And when I do that, it's going to ask me to put it in the Motif Patterns directory automatically. Now, it's also going to create automatically behind the scenes a little thumbnail of it, so when we look at it in our motif stitch selector, you'll be able to see a preview of what that pattern looks like. So I'm going to just call this test diamond. All right, and we will click save, and it will save that motif stitch. Now, if I get a new design window and I were to put in a motif run, and I'm going to do that by taking a piece of artwork, and I'm going to draw a line, and I'm going to right click to end it, and then I'm going to change that into a motif with my one click. It's going to put in my standard 201 to start with, but if I come down here, if I scroll all the way down now to the T's where I put my pattern, I'll see it's actually down here at the bottom. It's going to show test diamond. Now if I move off it, you'll see that it automatically put those stitches in purple to let you know that that is a custom one that you added. So if I go ahead and click that, now my diamond, if I click apply, will be in there, and it's got a pattern size that's kind of independent of how I drew it. But if you want to see it at the actual size, I can put it up to 10 where we drew it, and I can make it say even a 6 and click apply, and it will make it that size. Now we've talked about this in motif, but just to review, the run spacing here, this is going to put some space between the motif stitches. So if I put in 3 millimeters here and click apply, you'll see I get some space between those motif stitches. And then again, this stitch length here, this really doesn't do anything, so you don't need to worry about that. All right, so that is how you create a custom motif in FTCU. So now we're going to talk about creating your own standard fill patterns. And I've got standard fill pattern up here, and this is called pattern 1. So if I select it and we look over here in our properties box, you'll see that it's pattern 1. Now this is the most common fill. It's also known as a tatami fill. And you can, from this standard set of patterns, pick any of these that are in here that we give you. So you've got brick wall, cornrow, 2 different kinds of patterns, a random fill, satin fill, smooth fill, snakeskin, zigzag, etc. So let's just take a look at brick wall here and click apply, and you'll see here that it has a different stitch pattern in here because of the way that the needles dropped and the way the threads are arranged in that particular pattern. Now what we're going to talk about is if you want to create your own standard stitch patterns like this, how you would do it. So the way you do it is with our standard pattern editor, and it's here under tools, and you click standard pattern, and it's going to bring up this dialog here, and it's going to default to brick wall, but you can actually load in any of the other standard patterns as a starting point. Now this is important. You just can't create one from scratch. You have to start with one of the standard patterns, and then what happens is you'll modify it, and then you can actually save it with your own custom pattern name. In fact, that's about the only thing you can do. It will not let you resave a built-in pattern with an edited pattern. So if you wanted to change what this brick wall did, you couldn't change these stitches over here and then resave it over the top of brick wall. You would have to give it a new name. Now there's some gotchas with that because you can actually delete the brick wall by clicking this icon right here, so don't do that inadvertently. This is for deleting your custom ones if you didn't like them, but don't delete one of the built-in ones or there's no way to get it back. So let's take a look at some of the other patterns. I'm just going to load one in here. Let's load in pattern 1, which is our standard tatami fill, and you can see it's kind of a stepped pattern here. And let's just talk about what we're looking at here in terms of what the properties are here. So this is your save icon. This lets you save it. This is your delete icon. Again, make sure you use this with caution that you don't delete one of the built-in patterns inadvertently. This is our stitch length. Now, this is kind of a misnomer. It's not really the stitch length. It's really the spacing between the repeats of the pattern. What it's measuring is actually a system called points, and what a point is 1/10 of a millimeter. So that means there's 10 points per millimeter. So a value of 40 is actually 4 millimeters. So what that means is I'm going to have 4 millimeters between each repeat of the pattern, okay? So that means this pattern is going to be 4 millimeters before it repeats, all right? So that's what this parameter does. The number of offsets is actually the number of rows in our pattern. So this one has 4, and you can see here that these first 4 rows, these are bold, and these ones over here, they're just repeats of it, so you can kind of get an idea of how the pattern repeats. But when you want to move a point around, you can actually use any of them, but probably a good idea to use the first 4 in this case. And if we were to change the number of offsets, it would make more of them. And here you can see for row number 1, row number 2, or column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4, and the values. Now the help and the manual says you can type in these values, or you can use the up-down arrows to do that. Actually, that no longer is the case. The only way to adjust them is over here, and you can see what you're doing over here, but you can't actually adjust them. And what this is the percentage off the baseline of the pattern. So this one is 0, and you can see that it's down here. This is number 4. Number 1 is 25% of the way up. Number 2 is 50%, or right in the middle. And number 3 is 75% of the way up. And then up here would be the baseline again. So you can kind of see that in here, how that repeats. So if I were to move a stitch around, like let me just actually move this one up here, you'll see that they all move together. Now I've got them in a line, and you can see here in my preview how I have changed that pattern. So I started with a built-in pattern, and I have modified it. So you can change the number of offsets, which will change this. It's going to reset these probably down to 0 when you do that. But if I like the way this pattern looks, I can save it with a new name. So what I'm going to do is, let's call this zigzag 2, because I know we have a zigzag in there. So I'm going to go ahead and save it. It's going to ask me for a name, and I'm going to call it zigzag 2, and I'm going to say OK. And then when I'm done, I can close it. And if I'm playing with a pattern over here and I want to go back to the baseline, I can click reset, and it'll warn me that everything's going to be lost. And I'm going to say yes, that's okay, because I've already saved it. But it saved it to just what it was. Now if I moved it a little bit, then if I click reset, it would go back to the way it was. Okay, so it went back to the original there. And again, if I want to look at a different pattern, I can simply load that. So you'll see my brick wall pattern actually has 12 offsets, and it kind of steps like this, and you get that idea. All right, so that is the standard pattern editor. Now let's see what happens over here. So if I select this and I come over here to my standard pattern, zigzag 2 ought to be at the bottom, and yes, there it is. And I haven't got right down to it yet, but you can see that it is in green. And you see my real zigzag is right here, and it went above it because this one had a dash in it, this one didn't. So you see that it's in green to tell me it's a custom pattern. So now if I select that and click apply, you'll see I have that new pattern in there. So that is the zigzag pattern. Now you'll notice that this pattern's running this way, which is the default way it comes in. But if I want to change it to look more like what I created, what I would do is come here and click my shape tool, and I would just change my angle from going across to going up and down. So I just come up here to 0, and it doesn't really matter where I am. I'm just using 0 as a reference to make sure I get reasonably straight up and down. When I right click, you'll see that it's going to swap that pattern around, and now I've got the zigzag running kind of the way I created it. So that is your standard pattern editor in FTCU. So the last thing we want to talk about in this section is how to create your own custom fancy fills, also known as embossed fills. And these are fill patterns that have a series of needle drops in them that create this fancy pattern in the fill. And I have gone ahead and put up an embossed pattern here so you could see what it looks like. I'm going to select it so that over here in our properties box we can see what pattern I've selected. So you can see I've selected 201, and I'm going to click the drop down here so you can see what some of the other patterns look like. And we have lots and lots and lots of patterns in here, and you can, of course, now create your own pattern. So let's just stay on 201, and I don't have to do anything because I haven't changed anything. And I'll click off it again so you can see that pattern a little better. And it's kind of a diamond pattern here. And the reason that I wanted you to take a look at this is because when we get to our fancy motif or fancy embossed pattern editor, you will see how it's created a little bit easier. So we're going to get to our fancy pattern editor by coming here to Tools and going to our fancy pattern editor. And right now, of course, the only thing I can do is load in a fancy pattern. Now, if I load it in right here, it's going to come in on top of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a new design window, and I'm going to go back to Tools and go to my fancy pattern editor and load in a fancy pattern. And again, this is a good way to figure out what we've done to create the pattern that you see. And I'm just going to select this one here, which is the same pattern, 201, and you can see how that looks. And I'm going to go ahead and open it up, and you will see that that is actually artwork that is created in the shape of this particular pattern. So when we look at the way this was created and we go back over here and we look at this motif, it doesn't actually look like that when we look at it, because we're seeing a repeat of the pattern and we're seeing it multiple times. So we're tending to look at just this little diamond here, but if we look over here, you'll see what's been created is actually a set of 4 plus halves of the other diamonds here. So when this all meshes together, it ends up looking like it. Now, we could have created it as a single diamond and it probably would have looked the same, but it wouldn't have had these stitches going through the center here, so it wouldn't have looked identical. So let's just take a look at some other fancy patterns. I'm going to delete this. We'll come back over here and we will change this one to something different. So let's change it to a 203. Let's use 209. We'll see how that one's created. I'll click apply so you can see how it looks. And you can see how that one looks. Okay, I'll click off it so you can see it a little better. And that's a much bigger pattern, and it looks entirely different. So what we're going to do now is load that pattern in over here, and I will go back to my tools and go to my fancy pattern editor, load the pattern. And that one was 209, so I'm going to click it, and you can see how that one was created. So I'm going to open it, and you'll see that that one is actually some lines and a circle. And if I expand this, we'll see that it's all one object, but that's because it's been combined, all right? And if we look at the size of this, we'll see in millimeters it's about 7 by 11 millimeters. So again, you want to create your pattern in that kind of a 10 by 10 or 12 by 12 box. And let's just delete this one, and we'll reload in the first one we looked at to check its size. We'll look at 201 and click open, and we'll come here to transform, and yeah, that's a 10 millimeter by 10 millimeter. So if you stay in that kind of a box, you will have much better luck creating your motif patterns and having them stitch out correctly. Now, again, these are not stitches, these are actually artwork, and you're going to have to create them with the artwork tools. And we've shown you how to do that in the section on how to create lines and shapes and things using the artwork tools, so refer back to that. But we are going to now create our own custom fancy or embossed fill pattern. And to do that, I'm actually going to delete this one. So I can do that either with my artwork line tools if I want to draw straight lines or even curves or even something freehand. So any artwork creation mode that you have learned about will work, including using a built-in shape, using one that comes from a vector file that you import, or you can use any of the built-in drawing tools like our ellipse or squares or whatever. So let's do that. I'm going to use the ellipse. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a pattern in my 10 by 10 box here that's an ellipse that looks like this and another one that goes like that. So I'm just going to start up here, and I'm just going to drag an ellipse about the right size and about the right shape that I want. And I'm going to let off the mouse. Now, I didn't get that perfect, so I'm going to come over here to my transform tab, and I'm going to, instead of 9.9, I'm going to make it 10, and that was probably close enough. And I don't have maintain aspect ratio checked, so when I change this bottom one, it's going to leave my width at 2.5, which is good. So I'm going to go ahead and click apply, and I am going to actually center this up to my rulers, and I could drag it over there, but I can also come right here to my alignment tool and click center to rulers, and it's going to put it right there at 0, 0 for me. Now I'm going to make another one of these by doing copy and paste, and then my second one here I can see is selected, so I'm going to rotate that 90 degrees, and now I've got my pattern done. And if I select everything, I will see, if I go to my transform box, that my pattern is exactly 10 by 10, which is exactly what I want it to be. Now that I have it selected, I can save this as a embossed fill pattern or fancy fill pattern. So if I come here to my tools and I go to my fancy pattern editor, now save fancy pattern is lit up, and if I click it, it's going to show me something that doesn't look anything like my design. And why is that? That's because of these controls down here. So first of all, let's look at the offset. This offset is offsetting from the 0, 0 point. So what it's doing is it's taking the design that is 5 millimeters away from 0 to 5 millimeters away from 0. So it's basically offsetting the design into one part of it. And here in my dimensions, remember I designed it 10 by 10, and it thinks right now it is 5 by 5. So let's fix our dimensions first. Let's put in 10, and we'll put in 10, and you would think that would fix it, but again, it doesn't look right, and that's because my offset is wrong, and where I have my center point is 0, 0, and so I'm going to change my offset also to 0, 0, and when you do that, you can see that my pattern now looks correct. If I wanted to take a piece of an artwork and chop it up using these dimensions and offsets, I could. All right, so right now this pattern is going to align itself to itself. So it's going to start and stop on these points here, and it's going to make a contiguous pattern that looks like that. And that's what I want. But if I wanted some spacing between them, I could actually change my dimensions to accomplish that. So if I wanted a 2 millimeter space between them, I could put in 12 here and 12 here, and you'd see I'd have that pattern spaced out when it filled in that fill. But instead, I'm going to leave it the way I wanted it at 10 by 10. So I've got my pattern now, and I'm going to click Save, and it is going to ask me for a name, and we'll call this Ellipses, and I am going to save it, and it's going to put it into my fancy pattern selector. So I'm going to go ahead and close this now. And do I still have a pattern over here? I do. So let me select that. And now that we've created a fancy pattern, we'll be able to scroll down on our list to the E's, and we should see it. So here's our ellipses pattern, and I'm going to apply it, and we'll see what our pattern looks like. And it looks kind of like what we drew, okay? It looks like those ellipses. And if I want to change the way that they're running, I could come in and change my angle of this using my shape tool, etc. And I could scale the embossing. I could actually change the emboss angle all by itself without changing the way the stitch direction goes by using this control. And if I want to, I can make the emboss pattern bigger or smaller here, as I said. So that is how you create your own fancy pattern fills.